the deal that never reached Parliament. There was no debate broadcast live, no vote recorded, no document released for public scrutiny. And yet, an agreement shaped outcomes across borders, markets, and institutions without ever passing through a legislature. To understand why this mattered, we must return to a moment when formal approval was impossible. Timelines collapsed. Political consensus fractured. Any proposal sent to Parliament risked delay, amendment, or outright rejection. But the system could not wait. Action was needed faster than democracy could move. The first reveal begins with alignment outside public view. Officials spoke in parallel, not in chambers but in corridors, calls, and closed sessions. Language remained informal. Commitments were implied rather than written. What emerged was not a treaty, but a shared understanding of limits. What would be enforced, what would be tolerated, and what would be quietly supported. The second beat followed as behavior shifted immediately. Policies adjusted without announcement. Enforcement softened in unison. Funding conditions changed through interpretation rather than law. Markets responded not to legislation, but to consistency. The deal worked because everyone acted as if it existed, even though it officially did not. What made this possible was mutual constraint. No side could claim victory. No side could expose the arrangement without collapsing it. Silence became the binding force. The deal survived precisely because it had no text to challenge, no clause to dispute, no vote to overturn. By the time parliaments debated related issues, the outcome had already been shaped. Choices narrowed. Alternatives disappeared. Democracy remained intact in form, but the decisive moment had passed elsewhere. This was not a conspiracy. It was governance under pressure, and it revealed a truth modern systems struggle to admit. Sometimes the most powerful agreements are the ones no one is allowed to see. As the quiet deal took hold, its consequences spread faster than any formal law could have. Institutions adjusted internally, treating the unwritten agreement as settled reality. Risk calculations changed. Compliance teams revised priorities. What mattered was no longer what statutes demanded, but what enforcement would actually allow. The reveal deepened as the deal proved resilient. Because it was never written down, it could not be challenged directly. Courts had nothing to review. Legislatures had nothing to repeal. The arrangement existed only through behavior, and behavior aligned across borders with remarkable consistency. What could not be debated also could not be delayed. The conflict emerged in legitimacy. Decisions with enormous impact had bypassed public process. Outcomes were justified after the fact, framed as inevitability rather than choice. Citizens were told there was no alternative, without ever being shown the moment alternatives disappeared. Accountability dissolved into complexity. The build-up intensified as the deal hardened into precedent. Future decisions referenced it implicitly. Boundaries set in silence became assumptions in policy. What began as emergency coordination evolved into an informal architecture of power, operating alongside formal institutions, but beyond their reach. Inside government, discomfort grew. Officials understood the danger. If parliaments were seen as irrelevant in moments that mattered most, trust would erode. Yet reversing the deal was unthinkable. Exposing it would destabilize what it had quietly stabilized. The system was trapped by its own success. By now, the paradox was clear. The deal had worked precisely because democracy had been too slow to act. But each time this logic succeeded, it weakened faith in democratic process itself. Efficiency had won the moment, but at a long-term cost. The question was no longer whether the deal should have reached Parliament. It was what happens when the most important decisions never do. The tension peaked when the consequences of the unseen deal became impossible to ignore. Policies across multiple countries began moving in the same direction without coordination being acknowledged. Outcomes converged. Options narrowed. Observers noticed alignment without explanation, and suspicion followed. The conflict sharpened as democratic institutions struggled to respond. Parliaments debated measures whose real impact had already been decided elsewhere. Votes felt symbolic. Amendments changed language, not trajectory. The center of gravity had shifted away from public process, leaving elected bodies reacting to fait accompli. The buildup intensified inside the system itself. Officials worried about precedent. If silence could replace consent once, it could do so again. Each unwritten deal made the next easier to justify. Emergency logic bled into normal governance. What was meant to protect stability began hollowing out legitimacy. Public trust thinned quietly. People sensed decisions were being made beyond reach, justified by urgency rather than mandate. Even when outcomes were positive, the process felt absent. Stability without visibility began to feel imposed rather than earned. The deal's strength, its invisibility, became its weakness. Inside policy circles, debate grew sharper. Some argued that speed justified bypassing procedure. Others warned that democracy erodes not through overthrow, but through irrelevance. If the most critical moments never reached Parliament, then Parliament authority would fade even in calm times. By this stage, the cost of the unwritten deal was clear. It had stabilized the system, but destabilized trust. It solved the crisis while creating a deeper one beneath the surface. Governance had become efficient, but detached. The system had avoided delay, but it had also avoided consent. And once consent is missing, stability rests on increasingly fragile ground. The reckoning arrived not through exposure, but through reflection. Leaders began to recognize that what had saved the system once could not become its default method of survival. Speed had been necessary. Silence had been effective. But repetition carried a cost that stability alone could not repay. The climax unfolded when boundaries were finally drawn. Informal coordination was acknowledged without being celebrated. Emergency alignment was framed as exception, not alternative governance. Mechanisms were introduced to pull future decisions back into public process once immediate danger passed. The goal was not to undo the deal, but to prevent it from becoming precedent. This shift reshaped behavior quietly. Officials became more cautious about bypassing institutions. Silence was used sparingly. When informal alignment occurred, it was paired with delayed disclosure rather than permanent invisibility. Democracy was not restored in the moment of crisis, but it was reasserted afterward. The resolution followed unevenly, but deliberately. Parliaments reclaimed relevance not by stopping emergencies, but by absorbing their outcomes into accountable frameworks. What had been decided in corridors was debated later in chambers. Consent returned after urgency, imperfect but necessary. What endured from the deal that never reached Parliament was a hard-earned lesson. Systems may need speed to survive shock, but legitimacy requires return. When urgency replaces consent too often, stability loses its foundation. Governance becomes fragile precisely when it appears most efficient. Europe learned that democracy does not have to be fast, but it must be included eventually. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The